Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Choi Young-mi, whom I'm reading out of three poets of modern Korea. Choi is a contemporary poet. She really sort of came to prominence as a writer in the 1980s, and she's still around today, as far as I know. Her poetry at least the poetry that's collected in this anthology, has sort of two major things that are really interesting about it. One is that she was part of this wave of pro-democratic demonstrations in 1980s South Korea. Up until then, South Korea had been ruled, I think, basically as a military dictatorship. It was a very autocratic government. And in the 1980s, people, led, as is so often the case, by students, really started to push for democratic reforms. Cho was part of that movement. And there's this interesting sort of thing, there's this interesting attitude that seems to pervade her poetry about this period. And I think there was this sort of sense that this was a general sort of zeitgeist type issue, where on the one hand, there is this push for democracy, which is an inherently hopeful, sort of future-oriented activity. And yet, the government of South Korea responded very, very violently to these protests. And so I think there was this sense of sort of malaise mixed in with the pro-democratic ambitions. And then when democracy was actually achieved in South Korea, I think there was this sense that, okay, we've been campaigning for this thing, and now we've got it. Now what do we do? A bit like at the end of The Princess Bride, right? Where Inigo Montoya is like, I've been in the revenge business for so long, now that it's over, I don't really know what to do. I think there is this sort of sense of like, we had been working for this goal, that we had really sort of shaped our political identities, much of our time, our effort, our ambition, our hopes had gone into this pro-democracy movement. Now that we have democracy, what do we do with those ambitions, those hopes, those goals, that energy, etc.? And again, I think there was this sort of malaise that settled over many of the people who had been involved in this pro-democracy struggle. So that's one element, is these sort of complicated ambivalences around the pro-democracy movement. The other thing that's really striking about Choi Young-mi's poetry is that Korea is a very traditional country, generally speaking. Strong Confucian values, partially because Korea is sandwiched between Japan and China, both of which have sort of competed for control over it. Korean culture has tended to be very regimented, very traditional, and it's a sort of defense mechanism. When Cho's poetry started coming out in the 1980s, and she was writing about having sexual relationships with men, this was shocking to people. Again, very traditional culture, very conservative culture in many ways, especially in the 80s. I think it's somewhat liberalized since then, but these were really quite stunning poems in their openness and honesty, in a way that they might not have been in other cultures that were more socially liberated, let's say. So I'm going to read you a few of Cho's poems, and you'll get this sense. So this is For Tea, Light Red Over Black. That's for Tea with his face. Would be somebody's name redacted, basically. Now a photograph of some other woman with breasts like melons grins on the far wall of your room. Now another pretty face lies down in your dream's territory and sleeps with her head in the crook of your arm. One day anonymous flowers blossomed in the grasslands of my youth's sweetest oblivion. When I turn my memory's random, dog-eared pages, sun blots the landscape's yellowed margins. Take the painting, the color of dark blood, out of its frame. I'll come to you in those blunt drops. So again, this very sort of open depiction of sexuality in a way that would be very unsettling for a conservative, traditional Confucian society. The next one I'm going to read you is in the same sort of vein. It takes that same sort of focus on sexuality, on physicality, the corporeal, right? Eating, drinking, fucking, basically. Song in a Dolorous Cafe. It seems as though I've stopped here before. Seems I drank here one day, in this light, this seat, this cafe. The madam with slightly sunken dimples, her eyes, her smile, looks far too familiar. With what chap did I pluck the flower of random desire without any guilt at all? With which one did I find some excuse for a little bit of darkness? Was it when my blood peaked at scalding that I scratched and licked the whole night long, feigning some random ill, or concocting an itch and artificial swelling? We pillaged each bar wretch and wench, we hacked away at their sob stories on the chopping board of inebriated pity. We laughed, we beat our fists on the table, we guzzled our drinks and sang, and once or twice our vision got tangled. So well. Fear is mine and shame on me, this seat, this cafe, the witness of my debauchery. And then the last one that I'll read you specifically that's in this vein is one that's called And. And this one's a little more personal. Not necessarily as much about relations with other people, but still this very sort of shocking very untraditional depiction of what a woman, how a woman was supposed to live and view the world in Confucian tradition. This is And. There are days when I am completely useless. The uncorked bottle of wine might sway its weight in the refrigerator, but there are days when I can neither drink nor smoke. One by one, numbers are erased, fraying the pages of my little black book. Ready to meet a new man, a woman wearing the scarf given to her by an old lover stands looking into a mirror. Snot is drying along the corner of a half-read newspaper. Time rises up clearly in autumnal sunlight. Time swells like a tomb in the day with which I must find something to do. But they're not all sort of eat, drink, and be merry type poems. There's also this, again, sort of pervasive sense of decline, of loss, of sort of purposelessness, this sort of vague wandering almost in the sort of post-democracy period, or the not post-democracy, in the sense of the period after which democracy has been achieved. This sort of sense of, like, again, cultural malaise, I think, is a good term for it. And we see that in a poem like In a Subway Number 4. 3 women are dozing off, a woman's head leaning against a woman's shoulder, the woman's shoulder over a woman's chest. The woman's tiredness on another's worries, do, re, mi, side by side. 3 men are boring their way through the passengers' sluggish, parboiled gazes. 3 men step into the swell of subway flesh packed tight as if wrapped in pork skin. First a beggar holds out his hand, next a blind man sings a song, after them a bushy-headed prophet shouts everyone awake. Brothers and sisters, prepare for the end. 3 women are dozing off, 3 men are fast approaching. 11 o'clock in the morning, the subway is full of the unemployed. Again, this sort of sense of loss, this sense of almost this maybe betrayal is a sort of good way of thinking about it. This this feeling that, like, democracy was supposed to solve problems, and yet problems persist. I don't know if that's necessarily a sort of accurate way of putting it, but there is, I think, in this sort of sadness in a lot of Cho's poems, this sense that somehow things didn't work out the way they were supposed to work out, and we don't know what else can be done about it. It is a species of nostalgia, I would say. But there's also hope in the poems, and I think this last one I'm going to read you, I think really sort of represents that quite well. So this is called Birds Even Now. Between one asphalt road and another, high on the wind-stripped winter branches, you build in breakneck spells of construction. Never mind the soot of the northeastern wind, you shape a kingdom that will not flinch amid the roaring cranes, the playground noises. Your quarters go up in twig-black patches, darker than the skyward grime of soul. All for the sake of next spring's hatchlings. Your wings beat now in a flurry of labor. After the heavy sleep of darkness, after the first inch of daybreak, the twigs of Mount Buchan fit tight in your beak. Faithful as ever to the world of seen things long since seen, to all the myriad anchors of desire, you do not take leave from the human city. Even now your homes are multiplying. While I lounged in my blankets scratching my nose, while people were all in a stir at breakfast by the news of the fall of the Soviet Union, branch by branch your walls were erected, without rumor, without sound. Each nest with its own colossal architecture swells to a sphere with the ticking of seconds. No sooner than the first sweet sting of March wind, the little birds will kick clear of their shells. Do birds build their round houses so quietly in Moscow? My heart, it seems, is a nest of shame, and even today you are building your home. So again, I think this is an interesting one to me, because I do think it has that element of sort of malaise, of drifting, of a sense of purposelessness, maybe, or confusion, but it is linked to the ongoingness of the natural world in some ways. And of course, Korean poetry, East Asian poetry, sort of across the board, has long traditions of using nature imagery to explore thematics and human concerns. And so in this sense, Cho is playing, I think, with that sense, that sort of disconnect between the idea of the permanence, the seemingly permanent impermanence of nature, right? Because a bird's nest is a recurring feature. Birds build, as I think, not knowing anything about ornithology, birds build their nests largely by instinct, and so generation after generation, the nest will be built the same. And yet it's an impermanent structure. It is fragile, it is temporary, etc., etc. And I think there is something that's a wonderful metaphor for this sort of sense of precariousness that we see in Cho's poetry of this period.